Free yourself from the narcissist's orbit. I think there's a lesson in how the most basic unit of life, the atom, is structured and how our inner experience is also meant to be structured. So here's what an atom looks like. So as you can see here, you have the center or nucleus of the atom, which has these subatomic particles called protons and neutrons, which together carry a positive charge. Then you have these orbiting electrons that serve to create stability in the atom, and they carry a negative charge. And importantly, the center can't function without its satellite electrons. Well, similarly, the growing child has a self that might be thought of as the atom's nucleus, but that child needs others, particularly her parents, who can surround, encourage, respond to, and generally be available to the child in order to offer the needed balance to the child's nuclear self. Well, just like electrons serve the atom's nucleus, so each child in life starts with their self, their real self, in the center of their existence, then depends on their caretakers to recognize and nourish that center. And with good enough parents, those parents recognize the child's needs as legitimate, sees them as worthy of respect, and that it's expected that the child's going to use the parents for that child to meet the child's own needs, to in essence sort of nourish, water that center, that unique and authentic self. Well, something else, as you might imagine, happens for the scapegoat survivor of narcissistic abuse in the family. And in today's video, I'm going to use the metaphor of the atom to describe how a scapegoat is forced to orbit the narcissistic parent instead of the parent orbiting that child. So, in order that a strong self-structure gets to, develop and flourish. And that's what this diagram explains. Instead of the scapegoated child's self being at the center of his or her existence, the narcissistic parent has to, in essence, occupy and be in the center of that scapegoated child's existence. And the child's only choice is to really orbit around, as an electron would a nucleus, that narcissistic parent. Next, I'm going to explain how the scapegoated child is deprived of what he or she deserves. In essence, that someone else make themselves available to him or her so that the sort of nuclear self of the child has what it needs to grow and develop. And I hope you watch until the end, because I'll offer a strategy to recover your sense of entitlement to being the nucleus in your own life while expecting others at times to serve as electrons to your benefit. And this doesn't mean devolving into a state of selfishness. On the contrary, it's actually how real person-to-person connection happens. And I'm going to explain why. Well, my name's Jay Reed, and I'm a licensed psychotherapist in San Francisco, California. And I specialize in helping individuals recover from narcissistic abuse, both in individual therapy and through my online course and accompanying Facebook community. And across these platforms, we take a three-pronged approach to recovery that involves making sense of what happened, gaining distance from the narcissistic abuser, and living in defiance of the narcissist rules. And today's video falls under the category of living in defiance of the narcissist rules. And if you were a scapegoat survivor of a narcissistic parent or partner, then I encourage you to check out my free ebook on the topic. It's called Surviving Narcissistic Abuse as the Scapegoat. And it goes into really important aspects of what it's like to be in the shoes of the scapegoated child or partner of a narcissistic abuser. So the book discusses the self-limiting beliefs about yourself that you may have had to adopt in order to survive the narcissistic abuse, and also why the narcissist personality is so geared to put those closest to them down. And along with today's video, this ebook can really help you, realize how none of this abuse was your fault, but was rather the product of the narcissist's psychological and emotional problems or pathologies. And you can find the link to the book in the description below or by clicking here. And also, if you haven't already, I'd encourage you to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so that you're alerted when I post new videos on these kinds of topics. So how the scapegoat is forced to be an electron to the nucleus of the narcissistic parent. I really like this metaphor of the atom because it so clearly articulates what goes wrong for the scapegoated child of the narcissistic parent if the child tries to assume his or her rightful place in the center of their own life. The narcissistic parent, in essence, refuses to be the electron to his or her child's kind of nuclear self and really puts the child in this kind of a position. Well, as you can see, if the scapegoated child to the narcissistic parent tries to put themselves in the center, they're sort of utterly and kind of catastrophically alone. There's no sort of supporting structure vis-a-vis these electrons to be there for this sort of developing nuclear self of the child. Even just looking at this graph, that sort of like singular red dot, I sort of just find actually harrowing, just because I think it illustrates the kind of emptiness faced by the child to the narcissistic parent when they try to inhabit their own self. So in essence, I think the child necessarily learns and adapts to the conclusion that it's better to be the electron to someone else's nucleus than to be the nucleus without any electrons around, or people, as it were. Well, here's why the narcissistic parent refuses to be the electron to the child's nucleus. That parent starts with a core sense of worthlessness that is intolerable to the parent and must be, in essence, relocated into someone else, usually over whom that person has authority. Almost like a hot potato, or the game hot potato, where you got to, pass something because you don't want to hold it too long, it'll burn you. Well, enter the child to the narcissistic parent as a near perfect receptacle for the parent's cast-off feelings of worthlessness. And the narcissistic parent is able to do this because the only way they grant a shared reality with this child is if that child believes him or herself to be the worthless one. And when the child is forced to adopt the parent's malevolent view of him or her, there's an implicit way in which that child gets forced into an orbit of the narcissistic parent and doesn't get to live in the center of their own experience or existence. But again, this relegation to being the electron to the narcissistic parent's nucleus is still far better than being, that nucleus with no electrons for the child. Well, what does it then feel like to be in the orbit of the narcissistic parent for the scapegoated child? Well, the child is dislodged from his or her own nucleus in a fairly traumatic way. In essence, they learn that to be at the center of themselves and expect the narcissistic parent to be supportive electrons to them results in intense and intolerable feelings of abandonment, shame, emptiness, despair, hopelessness, and even rage. And in order for the child not to drown in these feelings, the only kind of psychological life preserver available is grabbed by the child. And that is being the electron to the narcissistic parent, or putting the parent's experience sort of as a substitute for their own in the center of their lives. And this affords an identity to the child and a bond to the parent that is certainly not good for that child, but far better than having no bond and sort of being nobody to no one, for that child, or being a nucleus in essence with no electrons. But once the child enters the orbit of the narcissistic parent, then life feels like it gets lived from the outside in rather than from the inside out. And the child's forced to substitute the narcissistic parent's feelings, needs, and preferences for the child's own. And a real muting of the significance of the child's own inner life often occurs, so that the child's not reminded of the agonizing state of being that's really at the center of their true experience. It's sort of like working to turn down the volume of this really profound and central suffering they're having to endure by not, in essence, being paid attention to for who they truly are in this world. And no matter how much sort of erasure of the child's inner nucleus happens, there's often a preserved hope that the child can eventually find suitable electrons so that he or she might resume life from the center of themselves. And that kind of goes to what recovery from being in the orbit of a narcissistic parent might look like. Well, as you can see, here's where safe friends, partners, and even safe therapists can really serve vital roles in being the kind of supported electrons to the scapegoat survivor's nuclear self that were not available earlier in that survivor's life. The task for recovery can be thought of reoccupying the center of one's own experience, which is really the seat of the trauma faced earlier in life, where if you inhabited your nuclear self, there was no one and nobody around. And I think in a lot of ways, it's like recovering from PTSD symptoms after, say, surviving a car crash. There may be intense flashbacks, overwhelming fear, tension, etc., when that survivor of the car crash goes to drive, say, his or her car again. But with repeated exposure to driving the car, these symptoms tend to subside over time. And similarly, for recovery from scapegoat and narcissistic abuse, repeated occupants of one's nuclear self while in the ongoing company of safe friends, partners, and therapists really gradually allow these sort of post-traumatic flashbacks to subside. Flashbacks sort of in essence to that abandonment, that despair, and that sort of sense of helplessness that would happen earlier in life when occupying the center of one's experience and existence. Those things tend to subside with this ongoing willingness to hang in there and be at the center while staying in the company of such safe friends, partners, and therapists. And really, I want to emphasize that there can be some real discomfort that comes initially at being in the center of your own experience. And it may even dominate or make it intolerable at times. But on the whole, I do see and have experienced that it's possible to feel more at the center of one's own experience while expecting others to sort of safely serve as supportive people as you occupy that center, and again, to serve as sort of electrons. And a lot of times survivors may fear that doing this will result in them being sort of completely selfish. But this is sort of a different model of connection than what was known with the narcissistic abuser or narcissistic parent. In this case, the idea is to take turns being in one's own nucleus and offering oneself up, again, voluntarily, almost from one's own nucleus, to serve as an electron to someone else out of genuine care for that person and sort of gratitude for how they've served as an electron, as it were, or supportive other to you, as opposed to feeling coerced to do so, or there being a sense that you must sort of orbit the other or else. And that's very much the feeling that happens in relation to a narcissistic, other person. And this is something, this sort of taking turns of being an electron or the other being an electron to you is called interdependency. And I think it affords both people to feel authentically connected to themselves and to the other person in sort of an ongoing kind of dyadic way. In short, there's an I, and then, for the other person, there's a you. That person's kind of maintaining their I. And then in this way of kind of taking turns being electrons to each other's nucleus, there's sort of a genuine we that exists. And a friend and I were having this discussion, and he made the point that you could think of coming together as forming compounds. If you want to get kind of nerdy about this, the chemistry here, the chemistry metaphor of two separate atoms coming together to form a compound, as opposed to one person having to abandon their center to serve as an orbiter or satellite of the other person. Well, I hope today's sort of analogy and diagram might help to kind of cohere some of the experience in your process of recovery from this type of abuse, and perhaps to know and think about or envision the benefit of sticking to your experience while expecting others to kind of be there in a supportive role and to help you stick to your own experience, that there's real over time benefit to that. And as with all these sort of strategies that are offered on this channel, I really can't stress enough the importance of sort of curating or cultivating a very patient, compassionate attitude with yourself as you try to employ these tactics, because sometimes they may just feel like too much or impossible. And that's okay. I think in the fullness of time, everything kind of becomes possible in the process of recovery. And there's usually a real sort of hidden wisdom when things don't feel right. at that moment in time. And so offering yourself some kindness and patience as you work through it, I think is invaluable, because it's such an important and nurturing way to treat yourself in the face of what might feel a frustration. And that's very antidotal usually to the way one was treated at the hands of a narcissistic abuser. Okay, well, thanks for tuning in. I hope you found today's video useful, and I look forward to posting again next Sunday. Take care.